was going to be writing a different article today and covering the meaning of the term Masonry as progressive science. But then I made a discovery that completely reshapes how we are to practice Freemasonry, and a discovery so profound that I must share it with you right now.
The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are of those individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, Masonic Authority, or craftsmanonline.com.
Welcome to the Daily Masonic Progress Podcast with your host, Right Worshipful Brother Darren Allett.
As part of writing this newsletter, I've been using AI to help me compose my thoughts into something that's a little bit more coherent than simply what spews out of my brain. Basically, it gives me another being of some kind to bounce off in order to develop my own understanding, and then it helps me restructure all of that raw information and helps me produce what eventually becomes, after I go in and edit it and rewrite it again, the final article. But to do this, I've actually had to study on the side literature, and more specifically, how literature is composed. And this is because you need to be able to instruct the AI how to write. And that led me to the discovery that I'm going to share with you today. In order to prompt AI to write, you have to give it specific instructions. You have to tell it how you want your sentences written, what language to use, what style, tone, vocabulary, which point of view should it take, and should it write with an active or passive voice. You really have to program it through your prompt to produce the output that you want. Otherwise, you're just going to get this typical AI stuff that you see everywhere. But what I found is that all of what we take for granted when we read and write is to an extent intuitive or learned through practicing it and through our schooling. And this mostly comes due to the fact that we had to do this for almost 12 years before we went into the big wide world. But we never really go into the depths of writing literature the same way that you'd actually go into writing a computer program. And this is where my side study has taken me. So when I was researching the phrase Masonry is progressive science and breaking that down to the meaning of the individual words, I found that this phrase uses a structure that I discovered the other day when researching literature. In English, our sentences are mainly composed to follow a subject, verb, object, word order. Or there are kind of minor variations of this with things like adverbs and adjectives and relative clauses, but I won't go into those as they're really not relevant to this particular discovery. So when breaking down the meaning of the phrase Masonry is progressive science, I realized that this phrase follows the subject Masonry, verb, progressive, object, science, word order. And this blew my mind because it then made complete sense as to why we need to master the liberal arts and sciences in order to be effective in how we learn and practice Freemasonry. Now, this may not necessarily seem as profound as what I'm making it out to be. It might seem quite obvious to you, but after all, as part of speaking English, we intuitively know this. But do we really know it, and do we actually understand it? Do we understand why it's important to be consciously aware of the word order in our sentences of the ritual? And especially when we're trying to ascertain the lessons of the practical or the moral instruction or the admonishment, the warnings that they're giving us in that text. And I say this because I hear so many people struggle to learn from Freemasonry. They come to the craft seeking to improve themselves, but many never do. And that's because we don't learn how to learn from our ceremonies. But this is where being consciously aware of the word order and sentence structure makes it easier for us to bridge the gap between the King James English of our ceremonies and the modern lexicon of language that we use today. So when we take this conscious awareness into the word order or the phrase in our ritual, not only does it allow us to understand the meaning, we understand the intention of the phrase. It gives us the how of how we're supposed to interpret the ritual, how we're supposed to learn these practical and moral lessons. Here's what I mean. See, if we use the term Masonry as a progressive science, as an example, let's first start by reversing it. You see, the object of Masonry is science, but objects can have many definitions. And like in computer science, such as programming or prompting an AI, the object itself, in this instance, science, can be a variable. It can be a data structure, it can be a function and method. And it can be anything that is visible or tangible and is relatively stable in form, such as a thing, a person, or the matter to which thought or action is directed. So from the word object, we then get objective. Now, objectives are factual, they're goals or things that we aim at. And we then have science of Masonry, where the goal or objective of Masonry is science. Now, where does the verb come into it? Well, the point of the verb, it tells us how, or gives us the action or instruction that must occur for the objective, science, of the subject, Masonry, to be achieved. And this means, in this instance, that we are progressively to obtain the object, science, of the subject, Masonry. And this tells us exactly what we need to know in order to learn what this phrase is teaching us through either an instruction or a warning, known as an admonishment. Now, you might be thinking, how does this exactly tell us why mastering the liberal arts and sciences is absolutely critical to practicing Freemasonry? Well, in our liberal arts and sciences, we have the trivium of language, being grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Grammar is the study of the structure, rules, and conventions of language. It involves understanding the parts of speech, the sentence structure, punctuation, and its syntax. Rhetoric involves understanding how the craft arguments appeal to emotions and to use language. And it teaches us techniques for organizing ideas and using things like figurative language and adapting our communication style to different contexts as well as audience. And then there's logic, which is about analyzing those arguments and identifying fallacies and constructing valid and sound arguments. And logic teaches us those critical thinking skills, enable us to evaluate information and make those informed decisions, as well as solve problems effectively. So by mastering grammar, rhetoric, and logic, that's crucial not just for practicing Freemasonry, but for understanding it. You see, these three disciplines form the foundation of effective communication, critical thinking, and symbolic and allegorical interpretation, which are absolutely essential to being able to learn any of the Masonic teachings from the symbolism and allegories in our ceremonies. And what it all boils down to is this. By mastering the liberal arts and sciences, specifically the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, we can be more effective in learning what our ceremonies are teaching. And by learning what our ceremonies are teaching, we can apply those lessons in our own lives. And thus, we achieve the ultimate aim of why we're Masons in the first place, for self-improvement through the practical and those philosophical lessons of the craft. And this brings us to the point. We can hear the ritual presented over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. But none of the meaning, even if the words stay in our brain like an earworm, if we never learn the meaning, it's never going to sink in if we don't practice it. And we can't practice if we don't learn. And I don't mean learn as in memorizing the words. I mean learn according to Bloom's taxonomy from the craft. And this then creates this infinite cycle that we're never able to get anything real from Freemasonry that you can't actually break until you use grammar, rhetoric, and logic to interpret from our ceremonies the lessons and their instructions. So what I've learned from figuring out how to have an AI assist with writing this newsletter is that I've needed to deepen my own studies into the trivium. You see, writing a prompt for an AI and delving into the meaning of our rituals has forced me to work towards, well, the process of working towards and learning to master those liberal arts and sciences. It's forced me to dig deep into the trivium so that I can truly and deeply understand the words that are on the very page in our ritual book. But the most profound thing, the beauty and perfection of Masonry, the system of morality that it gives you. You see, Masonry gives you the lessons on how to actually study it so you can understand it. It's kind of meta. You know, it teaches you how to learn from it, which is it teaching you how to learn from it. It's crazy. It's this self-fulfilling prophecy. And Freemasonry gives us those tools literally to be able to master it itself. We just have to look inside our ceremonies for the answer. Although there is the old adage of the quality of an answer is directly proportionate to the quality of the question. So we do need to spend more time refining our questions and getting very specific on the questions that we want to ask Masonry so that we can get the appropriate answers that we're after.
This has been the Daily Masonic Progress Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure you follow us on Spotify.